Can you imagine being thrown out onto the street with 3 hungry children because you couldn't pay 2 months of rent? It seems cruel beyond belief, but this story happened in the interior of São Paulo in 1925. What this widow didn't know was that a retired judge was watching everything, and what he was about to do would change not only her life, but expose a web of corruption that had been hidden for years. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because the twist in this story will leave you speechless. The surprise that this judge prepared was something nobody expected. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these emotional stories are reaching. Clara Mendes was 34 years old when her world collapsed on a cold June morning in 1925. She stood on the cobblestone street in front of what had been her home, watching as everything she owned was thrown onto the pavement like garbage. Her 3 children huddled behind her, confused and terrified. Clara was a woman who had once been beautiful, though hardship had aged her prematurely. She had dark brown hair that she kept tied in a simple bun, strands of gray already showing despite her relative youth. Her eyes were a deep brown, intelligent but tired, with dark circles that spoke of too many sleepless nights. She had high cheekbones and a straight nose, features that suggested she'd come from better circumstances. Her clothes were clean but worn, a simple dark blue dress that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original fabric. Her husband, Paulo, had died 8 months earlier. He'd been a clerk in a law office, not a wealthy man but respectable, earning enough to keep his family fed and housed. Then the influenza epidemic had swept through São Paulo. Paulo caught it while helping at the emergency hospital the church had set up. He lasted 5 days before the fever took him. Clara's 3 children were her entire world. There was Marina, 11 years old, a serious girl with her father's dark eyes and a maturity beyond her years. She'd taken to caring for her younger siblings with a dedication that broke Clara's heart. No child should have to grow up so fast. Then came the twins, Felipe and Fernanda, just turned 7. They were identical in appearance, both with Clara's lighter brown hair and small, delicate features, but opposite in temperament. Felipe was quiet and thoughtful, always watching, always thinking. Fernanda was energetic and optimistic, the one who still managed to smile despite everything. They'd lived in a small house in the Bella Vista neighborhood. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small sitting room. It wasn't much, but it had been home. The rent was 30 milreis per month, which Paulo had always paid on time to their landlord, Senor Horacio Campos. After Paulo's death, Clara had tried everything to keep up with the payments. She'd taken in washing, done seamstress work, cleaned houses, sold the few pieces of jewelry she owned. But it wasn't enough. She'd managed to pay the first month after Paulo died, then the second, but by the 3rd month, she was 2 weeks late. By the 4th month, she had nothing left to sell and no way to pay. Horacio Campos was a man in his 50s, short and thick-bodied with a permanent sneer on his fleshy face. He owned a dozen properties in the neighborhood, all of them rented to working-class families who could barely afford his inflated prices. He was known for his cruelty. He'd evicted a family with a sick baby the previous winter, and the baby had died 2 days later from exposure. When Clara begged for more time, promising she'd find a way to pay, Horacio just laughed. "I'm a businessman, not a charity," he said coldly. "You have 3 days to pay what you owe or get out. And don't think about trying to stay. I'll have the police remove you if necessary." Clara had spent those 3 days in a frantic search for the money. She went to the church, but Father Miguel could offer only prayers and a few coins. The church's charity fund was depleted from helping so many families affected by the epidemic. She went to Paulo's former employer, hoping for some kind of death benefit or assistance, but the law office was struggling itself and could offer nothing. She even swallowed her pride and went to her sister, Beatriz, who had married well and lived in a fine house in Higienópolis. But Beatriz's husband, Carlos, answered the door and told Clara coldly that they couldn't help every poor relation who came begging. He closed the door in her face before she could even finish asking. On the morning of the 3rd day, Horacio arrived with 2 large men and a police officer who looked uncomfortable but followed orders. "Time's up," was all Horacio said. Clara tried one last time. "Please, Senor Campos. I have children. Just give me 1 more week. I'm expecting payment for some sewing work." I've heard every excuse there is, Horacio interrupted. Out. Now. Or my men will remove you by force. The eviction took less than an hour. The men went through the house, throwing Clara's belongings onto the street. Furniture that had belonged to her parents. The children's clothes. A photograph of Paolo on their wedding day. Everything landed in a heap on the cobblestones while neighbors watched from windows and doorways, too afraid of Horacio to offer help. Marina stood silent, holding the twins' hands, her young face set in a mask of controlled fear. Felipe buried his face in his sister's side, trying not to cry. Only Fernanda sobbed openly, her small body shaking. When everything was out, Horacio locked the door with a new padlock and turned to Clara with a satisfied smirk. Learn to pay your debts, he said. Then he and his men walked away, leaving Clara and her children standing in the street surrounded by their possessions. What none of them knew was that someone had been watching the entire scene from across the street. Judge Henrique Ferreira had been sitting in his usual spot at the Café Modelo, having his morning coffee and reading the newspaper, when the commotion started across the street. At 68 years old, he was a fixture in the neighborhood. A tall, lean man with silver hair and a precisely trimmed white beard, always dressed impeccably in a dark suit despite his retirement. He'd been a judge for 40 years, most of that time in São Paulo civil court. He'd retired 3 years earlier, not because he wanted to but because the law required it at 65. He missed the work terribly, missed the pursuit of justice, the intellectual challenge, the satisfaction of making things right. Now he spent his days reading, taking walks, and observing life in the neighborhood from his regular table at the cafe. He lived alone in a comfortable apartment 2 streets away. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and his 2 daughters lived in Rio de Janeiro with their families. He saw them perhaps twice a year. He was, in short, a lonely old man looking for purpose. When he saw Horacio Campos and his thugs throwing a woman and 3 children out onto the street, something ignited in his chest, the old fire of righteous anger that had driven him throughout his career. He knew Horacio by reputation. The man was a slumlord, plain and simple. Over his years on the bench, Judge Ferreira had seen dozens of cases involving Horacio, always skirting the edge of legality, always finding loopholes, always victimizing the vulnerable. The judge paid for his coffee, folded his newspaper under his arm, and walked across the street. Clara was trying to organize her belongings, her movements mechanical, shock written across her face. The children stood close to her, the older girl trying to comfort the crying younger one. "Excuse me, Senora," Judge Ferreira said gently, removing his hat. "I couldn't help but witness what just happened. May I ask your name?" Clara looked up at him with wary eyes. She'd learned not to trust well-dressed men who approached with questions. But something in his face, a genuine concern, made her answer. "Clara Mendes, Senor." "And these are your children?" "Yes, Senor. Marina, Felipe, and Fernanda." Judge Ferreira nodded to each child. "I am Henrique Ferreira. I live nearby. I saw what Senor Campos did. May I ask, how much do you owe him?" Clara's face flushed with shame. 60 mil reis, Senor. 2 months of rent. My husband died 8 months ago. I've been trying to keep up with the payments, but I couldn't anymore. And where will you go now? Clara looked at her children, then back at the judge, and for the first time that morning, her composure cracked. Tears began to stream down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "I have nowhere. No family who will help. No money for even a night in a boarding house." Judge Ferreira was quiet for a moment, his sharp mind already working. Then he made a decision that would change everything. "I have a proposal, Senora Clara," he said. "I own a small house, just 3 streets from here. It's been vacant for 2 years since my mother-in-law passed away. It's modest. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, nothing grand. But it has a roof and walls and it's furnished with the basics. You and your children may stay there, rent-free, until you get back on your feet." Clara stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Senor, why would you do this? You don't know us." "I know enough," Judge Ferreira said firmly. "I know you're a mother trying to protect her children. I know you've been dealt an unfair hand by fate. And I know that Horacio Campos is a predatory landlord who deserves to be held accountable for his actions. He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to her. This is my address. Can you and your children walk 3 streets? It's not far. Yes, but senor, our things. Leave them for now. We'll arrange for them to be transported. First, let's get you and the children somewhere safe. Then we'll discuss the rest. Clara looked at the card, then at her children's hopeful faces, then back at this strange gentleman who had appeared like an angel. Why? She asked again. Please, I need to understand. Why are you helping us? Judge Ferreira smiled, a sad smile that held years of accumulated wisdom. Because, Senora Clara, I spent 40 years on the bench dispensing justice. Now I'm retired, and I find I miss it terribly. Perhaps this is my chance to practice a different kind of justice. The personal kind. Will you accept my help? Clara, with no other options and 3 hungry, scared children depending on her, nodded. Yes, senor. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good, Judge Ferreira said. Now, gather your children and follow me. And don't worry about Senor Campos. I have some ideas about how to deal with him. The house Judge Ferreira led them to was indeed modest, but to Clara and her children, it looked like a palace. It was a small single-story house with whitewashed walls and blue-painted shutters. Inside, it was clean and simply furnished. 2 small bedrooms with beds already made, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a sitting room with a worn but comfortable sofa and 2 chairs. It's not much, Judge Ferreira apologized. My late wife's mother lived here until she passed. We've kept it maintained but haven't rented it out. My wife had sentimental attachment to the place, and after she died, I couldn't bring myself to put strangers in it. It's perfect, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Senor Ferreira, I don't know how to thank you. Then don't try yet, he said with a slight smile. We have practical matters to attend to first. Do you have any money at all? Clara shook her head. A few coins. Maybe enough for bread for tonight. Judge Ferreira pulled out his wallet and placed several notes on the kitchen table. This should be enough for food for a week or 2. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. You can pay me back when you're able. For now, feed your children. Get them settled. Tomorrow we'll discuss longer-term plans. After the judge left, Clara fed her children the first proper meal they'd had in days. Bread, cheese, fruit, and milk that she'd bought from a nearby market. She watched them eat with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. That night, for the first time since they'd been evicted that morning, they all slept in real beds, under a real roof, safe and warm. But Judge Ferreira didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment, surrounded by law books he'd accumulated over 40 years, and began to investigate Horacio Campos. Over the next 2 weeks, while Clara settled into the house and began looking for steady work, Judge Ferreira conducted his investigation. He'd always been thorough. It's what had made him such an effective judge. And now, with nothing but time on his hands and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, he threw himself into researching Horacio Campos's business dealings. He started at the city registry office, looking up the properties Horacio owned. There were 12 in total, all in working-class neighborhoods, all rented at rates that seemed suspiciously high. But it was when he examined the property deeds that he found the first irregularity. 3 of the properties had been transferred to Horacio's name from their previous owners under suspicious circumstances. All 3 previous owners had been elderly, all 3 had died within months of transferring their property, and all 3 transfers had been witnessed by the same notary, a man named Sebastio Costa. Judge Ferreira knew Sebastio. He was a notary of questionable ethics who'd been investigated multiple times but never quite prosecuted. The judge made a note to look into him further. Next, he visited the housing court and pulled records of all eviction cases involving Horacio's properties. What he found disturbed him deeply. Over the past 5 years, Horacio had evicted 47 families. 47. Many of them for being just days late on rent, some of them in winter, some of them with small children or elderly members. But what really caught the judge's attention was a pattern. In many cases, after the eviction, Horacio had immediately rented the property again. but at a significantly higher rate than the previous tenant had been paying. It was a scheme. Evict tenants on technical grounds, then raise the rent for new tenants. It was legal, technically, but morally reprehensible. And Judge Ferreira suspected it might cross into illegal territory if he could prove Horacio was deliberately creating circumstances to force evictions. He dug deeper. He visited some of the families who'd been evicted, tracking them down to wherever they'd ended up. What he heard made his blood boil. One family told him how Horacio had claimed their rent payment was late when they had a receipt showing it had been paid on time. By the time they could prove it in court, they'd already been evicted and lost their belongings. Another family described how Horacio had suddenly demanded payment in full for repairs the tenants supposedly caused. Repairs that hadn't existed when they moved in, but which Horacio claimed were damage they'd done. A third family told him about how their rent had been raised by 50% with only a week's notice. Technically legal under their lease agreement, but practically impossible to pay, resulting in eviction. The more Judge Ferreira learned, the more convinced he became that Horacio was running a systematic exploitation operation. But knowing it and proving it in a way that would hold up legally were two different things. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Judge Ferreira had hired a young man named João, a law student at the University of São Paulo who needed extra money to help with research. João was sharp, eager, and had a natural talent for spotting patterns. Judge Ferreira, João said one evening, spreading documents across the judge's dining table. I think I found something important. Look at these eviction notices. He pointed to a stack of legal documents. These are all evictions Horacio filed over the past 2 years. Notice anything unusual about the dates. Judge Ferreira studied them. Then he saw it. They're all timed to occur just before major holidays or during winter months. Exactly, João said excitedly. Times when it's hardest for families to find new housing, when moving is most difficult. But there's more. Look at the reason codes he uses for the evictions. He pulled out another set of documents. In at least 15 cases, he's claimed property damage as grounds for eviction. But here's the interesting part. I cross-referenced these with city inspector reports. In 8 of those 15 cases, city inspectors had examined the properties within months of the eviction and found them in good condition. But Horacio's eviction filings claim severe damage requiring expensive repairs. Judge Ferreira leaned forward, his legal mind immediately seeing the implications. He's fabricating damage claims to justify evictions. That's fraud. There's more, João continued. I managed to track down 3 of the evicted families. They all told me similar stories. Horacio had demanded immediate payment for repairs they didn't cause. When they couldn't pay, he evicted them. But get this, after the evictions, he never actually made the repairs he claimed were necessary. He just rented the properties again immediately, at higher rates. Document fraud, false claims, systematic exploitation, Judge Ferreira murmured. This is beyond unethical landlord behavior. This is organized fraud. But we need more. We need documentation that directly connects Horacio to knowingly false claims. João grinned. I think I know how to get it. One of the evicted families I interviewed? The husband works as a clerk at the print shop that Horacio uses for all his legal documents. He's willing to talk. The print shop clerk's name was Miguel Santos. He was a thin man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and nervous eyes. He'd been evicted by Horacio 2 years earlier, supposedly for property damage that never existed. Judge Ferreira and João met him at a small cafe far from the neighborhood, where Miguel wouldn't be seen talking to them. I could lose my job for this, Miguel said, his coffee cup rattling in his shaking hands. But my family, we lost everything because of that man. If I can help stop him, it's worth the risk. Tell us everything, Judge Ferreira said gently. Miguel took a deep breath. Horacio brings his legal documents to our print shop. Eviction notices, lease agreements, property claims. My boss is his cousin, so he gets a discount and priority service. I've been setting the type for his documents for 3 years. And, Judge Ferreira prompted, about 6 months ago, I started noticing something. He'd bring in eviction notices that claimed property damage. But then he'd bring in new rental advertisements for the same properties, listing them as well-maintained and recently renovated. The timing didn't make sense. If there was really damage severe enough to justify eviction, how could the properties be rent-ready so quickly? Miguel pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I started keeping records. Dates, property addresses, what the eviction notices claimed versus what the rental advertisement said. It's all here. Judge Ferreira took the notebook, his heart racing. This was exactly what he needed. Direct evidence of contradictory claims. There's something else, Miguel continued. Last month, I overheard Horacio talking to my boss. He was laughing about how he'd just evicted another family. Said something about how these people are so stupid, they don't even know their rights. I can claim anything and they just accept it. My boss laughed with him. Would you be willing to testify to this in court? Judge Ferreira asked. Miguel hesitated, fear clear in his eyes. Then he nodded. Yes. My family is still struggling because of what he did to us. If testifying can stop him from doing it to others, then yes, I'll do it. Judge Ferreira reached across the table and shook Miguel's hand. You're a brave man, Senor Santos. What you're doing could help dozens of families. Over the next month, Judge Ferreira assembled what he privately called his case against corruption. Even though he was no longer on the bench, his legal training and experience guided every step. He gathered Miguel's testimony and documentation, city inspector reports contradicting Horacio's damage claims, testimonies from 15 evicted families, analysis of Horacio's rent-raising patterns, evidence of the suspicious property transfers involving the questionable notary, financial records showing Horacio's income had tripled over 5 years, primarily through evictions and rent increases. But there was a problem. Judge Ferreira was retired. He had no official authority to bring charges or conduct an investigation. He needed someone with current jurisdiction who would take the case seriously. Most of the current judges in São Paulo's civil court were younger men who viewed Judge Ferreira as an old-timer out of touch with modern practices. But there was one exception. Judge Marta Oliveira, one of the few female judges in São Paulo, who had clerked for Judge Ferreira 20 years earlier. Judge Ferreira arranged a meeting at her office. Judge Oliveira was now in her mid-40s. A sharp-eyed woman with graying hair she wore in a severe bun. She'd always been brilliant, and Judge Ferreira had supported her career when many of their colleagues had tried to hold her back because of her gender. Judge Ferreira, she said warmly, standing to shake his hand. It's been too long. What brings you to see me? He laid out everything. Clara's eviction, his investigation, the evidence he'd gathered, the pattern of systematic fraud and exploitation. Judge Oliveira listened intently, making notes, asking sharp questions. When he finished, she sat back in her chair with a grim expression. This is explosive, she said. If even half of what you've uncovered is true, Horacio Campos belongs in prison, not just facing civil penalties. But... She hesitated. But... Judge Ferreira prompted. But bringing charges against a landlord for how he runs his properties is complicated. Tenant law heavily favors property owners. Unless we can prove deliberate fraud, a good defense lawyer could argue that Horacio was simply exercising his legal rights as a landlord. That's why I've focused on the document fraud, Judge Ferreira said. The contradictory claims about property damage. That's not a matter of interpretation. That's false statements in legal filings. That's criminal. Judge Oliveira nodded slowly. You're right. And with this clerk's testimony, plus the inspector reports, plus the pattern you've documented, yes, I think we have enough for criminal charges. She smiled. You haven't lost your touch, Judge. This is solid work. Then you'll take the case? I'll do better than that, Judge Oliveira said. I'll take it to the prosecutor's office myself. And I'll recommend they prioritize it. This kind of exploitation of vulnerable families. It's exactly the kind of case that needs to be pursued. Judge Ferreira felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. The satisfaction of justice about to be served. While the legal wheels began turning, Clara's life had transformed. With the stress of homelessness lifted, she'd been able to focus on building stability for her children. She'd found steady work as a seamstress at a clothing factory. The pay wasn't much, but it was regular and enough to cover food and necessities. Judge Ferreira had continued to refuse any rent, despite Clara's protests. "Consider it payment for a service," he'd told her with a smile. "You've given an old man a purpose again. That's worth more than rent money." The children had thrived. Marina had enrolled in school again and was excelling. The twins had made friends in the neighborhood and were finally acting like children again instead of scared, hungry refugees. Clara visited Judge Ferreira every Sunday for lunch, an arrangement he'd suggested and she'd hesitantly accepted. She'd cook in his apartment. His own cooking was terrible, he admitted. And they'd eat together, talking about the week, about the children, about life. She knew he was investigating Horacio. He'd told her as much, but she didn't know the extent of what he'd uncovered. Until the day he asked her to come to his apartment in the middle of the week, saying he had something important to discuss. Clara arrived nervous, worried that something had gone wrong. Maybe he'd changed his mind about the house. Maybe he was going to ask her to leave after all. Instead, she found Judge Ferreira sitting at his dining table with another woman, a serious-looking lady in a judge's formal attire. "Clara, this is Judge Marta Oliveira," Judge Ferreira said. "Please, sit down. We have something to tell you." Clara sat, her heart pounding. Judge Oliveira spoke first. "Senora Mendes, Judge Ferreira has been investigating Horacio Campos's business practices. What he's discovered is that you weren't just unlucky. You were victim of a systematic fraud scheme. Horacio has been deliberately exploiting tenants, falsifying damage claims, and using illegal tactics to evict families so he can raise rents." Clara's eyes widened. I don't understand." "Your eviction was illegal," Judge Oliveira continued. "Horacio claimed you were 2 months behind on rent, but Judge Ferreira's investigation shows you'd actually paid for the second month. Horacio just didn't record it. He wanted you out so he could rent the property at a higher rate." Clara felt dizzy. "But I didn't have proof of payment. I gave him cash." "We found the proof anyway," Judge Ferreira said gently. "Miguel Santos, who works at the print shop, kept records. He recorded every payment Horacio received, including yours. You were only 1 month behind, not 2. The eviction was based on false claims." "What does this mean?" Clara asked. Judge Oliveira leaned forward. "It means Horacio Campos is being charged with fraud, document falsification, and multiple counts of illegal eviction. If convicted, he'll face significant prison time. But there's more." She slid a document across the table. "As part of the civil remedy for his victims, all his properties are being seized pending trial. When he's convicted, and he will be convicted, those properties will be sold and the proceeds distributed to his victims as compensation." "You'll receive substantial compensation, Senora Mendes," Judge Ferreira added. "Enough to buy a small house of your own, with money left over for your children's education." Clara stared at them, unable to process what she was hearing. "A house. Our own house." "Your own house," Judge Ferreira confirmed. "Free and clear. No landlord, no rent, no one who can take it from you. It's what you deserve, what all of Horacio's victims deserve." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "But how? How did you? Why did you do all this?" Judge Ferreira smiled, his eyes also glistening. "Because, my dear Clara, you reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. Not to sit behind a bench and mechanically apply laws, but to fight for justice for people who can't fight for themselves. You and your children needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That's all." Clara stood up, walked around the table, and embraced the old judge, sobbing. "You saved us. You saved my children. How can I ever thank you?" "You already have," Judge Ferreira said quietly, patting her shoulder. "You've given an old man a reason to get up in the morning again. You've given me back my purpose." The trial of Horacio Campos began 3 months later and lasted 2 weeks. It was one of the most closely watched cases in São Paulo that year. The prosecution, led by a young but fierce assistant prosecutor named Dr. Rafael Costa, presented overwhelming evidence. Miguel Santos testified about Horacio's falsified claims. 15 evicted families testified about their experiences. City inspectors testified about property conditions contradicting eviction claims. And Judge Ferreira himself took the stand as an expert witness, walking the court through the patterns of systematic fraud he'd uncovered. Horacio's defense tried to argue that he was simply a landlord exercising his legal rights, that any discrepancies were honest mistakes, that the tenants were lying to get compensation. But the evidence was too strong, the documentation too thorough, the pattern too clear. Judge Oliveira, presiding over the case, was merciless in her rulings. She struck down every defense objection, allowed every piece of evidence the prosecution wanted to present, and made her contempt for Horacio's actions clear in her instructions to the jury. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Horacio Campos was sentenced to 8 years in prison. His properties were seized and sold. The proceeds were distributed among his victims. 47 families in total, each receiving compensation proportional to what they'd lost. Clara received enough money to buy a modest but comfortable house in a good neighborhood, with a yard where her children could play. She also received compensation for her belongings that had been damaged during the eviction, and money to cover the financial hardship she'd endured. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was justice. It was validation. It was dozens of families finally being told, "What happened to you was wrong, and the person who did it is being held accountable." 6 months after the trial, Clara moved into her new house with her children. It was a beautiful day in early spring, and Judge Ferreira insisted on being there to help them move in. The house was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, the girls would share one, Felipe would have the other. A bright kitchen with modern appliances, a sitting room with space for the children to do homework, and best of all, a backyard with a lemon tree and space for a garden. As Clara stood in her kitchen in her house, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all be a dream," she told Judge Ferreira as he helped her arrange dishes in the cabinets. "It's real," he assured her. "You earned this, Clara. Never forget that. You worked hard, you never gave up on your children, and you maintained your dignity even when everything seemed hopeless. This isn't charity, it's justice. It's what you deserved all along. But none of this would have happened without you," Clara said. "You investigated, you built the case, you made sure Horacio faced consequences. You changed not just my life, but the lives of 47 families." Judge Ferreira shook his head. "I just did what any decent person should do when they see injustice. And truthfully, Clara, you helped me as much as I helped you. I was lost after retiring, purposeless. You gave me back my sense of meaning. Your family reminded me why justice matters." He paused, looking around the cheerful kitchen. "My wife would have liked you. She always said I needed to remember that law isn't just about statutes and precedents. It's about people. You reminded me of that." That evening, after Judge Ferreira had gone home, Clara gathered her children around the kitchen table. Their table in their house. "I want you to remember something," she told them seriously. "Judge Ferreira helped us when we had nothing and no one. He didn't have to. He did it because he believed in justice and in doing what's right. I want you to carry that lesson with you your whole lives. When you see someone who needs help, when you see injustice happening, don't look away. Be like Judge Ferreira. Stand up. Make things right." Marina, now 12 and wise beyond her years, nodded solemnly. "I will, Mommy. I'm going to be a lawyer when I grow up. Like Judge Ferreira, fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. I'm going to be a judge." Fernanda announced with the confidence of a 7-year-old. "I'm going to be." "I don't know yet," Felipe said quietly. "But I'll do something good. Something that helps people." Clara hugged her children, tears streaming down her face. "Your father would be so proud of who you're becoming." 20 years passed. Clara was now 54. Her children all grown. Marina had indeed become a lawyer. She ran a legal aid clinic in São Paulo, providing free legal services to low-income families. She'd handled hundreds of tenant rights cases over her career, helping families fight illegal evictions and predatory landlords. Felipe had become a social worker, dedicating his career to helping homeless families find housing and support services. And Fernanda, true to her 7-year-old proclamation, was in her final year of law school, planning to apply for a position as a court clerk, the first step toward eventually becoming a judge herself. Clara herself had continued seamstress work but also volunteered extensively with tenant rights organizations, sharing her story to help other families recognize and fight exploitation. And Judge Ferreira. Judge Ferreira was now 88 years old and in declining health. He'd lived a full life since helping Clara, finding new purpose in advocating for tenant protections and mentoring young lawyers like Marina. On a warm spring afternoon, Clara visited him in the hospital where he'd been admitted with pneumonia. His daughters were there from Rio, but they gave Clara private time with the old judge. He looked small in the hospital bed, his once strong frame now frail. But his eyes still held that sharp intelligence, that spark of righteousness. "Clara," he said, his voice weak. "I'm so glad you came." "I couldn't not come," she said, pulling a chair close to his bed. "Your family. You've always been family. How are the children?" "They're wonderful. They're exactly who you'd hope they'd become. Marina is helping families just like you helped us. Felipe is doing the same. And Fernanda." She smiled. "She's going to be a judge. A good one, I think." Judge Ferreira's eyes glistened. "That makes me so proud. But not surprised. They learned from you, Clara. You taught them what really matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Judge Ferreira spoke again, his voice even quieter. "Do you know what my greatest regret was before I met you and your children? It was that I'd spent 40 years dispensing justice from behind a bench, but I'd never really experienced what it meant to directly change someone's life. I'd ruled on cases, yes, but I'd never really connected with the people those rulings affected." He reached out a trembling hand, and Clara took it. "You gave me that experience, Clara. You let me into your life. You trusted me when you had no reason to trust anyone. And through helping you, I finally understood what justice really means. Not just applying laws, but actively fighting to make things right. That was the greatest gift of my life." Clara was crying now. "You saved us. How can you talk about me giving you a gift?" "Because you did," Judge Ferreira said with certainty. "You gave me purpose when I'd lost it. You gave me family when I was alone. You reminded me why I chose law in the first place. That's worth more than any verdict I ever delivered." He paused, his breathing labored. "Promise me something. Anything. Keep telling your story. Keep helping families recognize their rights. Keep teaching your children and grandchildren about justice and dignity and standing up for what's right. That's how we change the world. One person, one family, one act of courage at a time." "I promise," Clara whispered. Judge Ferreira smiled, squeezed her hand gently, and closed his eyes. He passed away peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by his daughters and with Clara holding his other hand. At Judge Ferreira's funeral, the church was packed. Not just with legal colleagues and family, but with dozens of people whose lives he'd touched over his 40 years on the bench and his 20 years of advocacy after retirement. Clara spoke at the service, her voice strong despite her grief. 20 years ago, I was thrown into the street with my 3 children and nowhere to go. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd failed my children. And then this man, this extraordinary man, appeared and changed everything." She looked around the church at all the faces. "But he didn't just help me. Over the years after he retired, he helped dozens of other families. He investigated corrupt landlords. He mentored young lawyers. He fought for tenant protections. He turned his retirement into a second career of direct personal justice." She smiled through her tears. "He used to tell me that I gave him purpose. But the truth is, he never lost his purpose. He just found a new way to live it. And he taught all of us that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It's something we do every day in how we treat people, in whether we stand up when we see wrong, in whether we help when we have the power to help." After the service, Clara stood outside the church with her 3 children. All adults now, all carrying forward the lessons Judge Ferreira had taught them. He really was like a grandfather to us, Marina said quietly. More than that, Felipe added. He showed us what kind of people we should try to be. Fernanda, always the emotional one, was crying openly. I'm still going to be a judge, she said fiercely. And I'm going to be like him. I'm going to remember that every case is about real people with real lives. I'm going to fight for what's right, not just what's legal. He'd be proud of you, Clara said. He'd be proud of all of you. And you know what? I think your father would be too. As they walked away from the church, Clara thought about the chain of events that had begun 20 years ago with an eviction and ended with a legacy of justice that would span generations. One retired judge had decided to help one desperate widow. And that simple act had rippled out, creating lawyers who fought for the powerless, social workers who helped the homeless, and a new generation of judges who understood that justice was about people, not just precedents. It proved what Judge Ferreira had always believed, that one person with courage and determination really could change the world. Not all at once. Not with dramatic gestures. But one act of kindness at a time. One case at a time. One family at a time. That was his legacy. And it would live on long after he was gone. So, what did you think of this story? Would you have the courage to help a stranger the way Judge Ferreira helped Clara? Or to stand up to injustice even when it's easier to look away? Leave your opinion in the comments. I read them all and love to know what you think. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Every week there are incredible stories like this one waiting for you here. And look, get your heart ready, because the next video I'm going to recommend is even more surprising. Click on the screen now and continue this journey of stories that touch the soul. See you next time, and may God bless you all.